I have a laundry list of things, but I'm only going to ask you. Well, I really like what you're doing with the context, but in part it's because it's what I'm doing with my own research with context. So we share that same interest. But following up on what Janet said, my immediate reaction to the whole thing, or a couple things. I wanted more information on what kinds of workers are in these cities. What does it look like? Is it manufacturing? What are they producing? Right? Where are these people working, and what? I know you talked about lots of different types of workers in this informal economy, but I think you're going to need to tweak it a little bit more for the theoretical part of what each labor force actually looks like.
And we actually do have that data. I cut it out. The slides, there were 42 slides. So
right.
I just kept cutting and cutting.
Right,
but, yeah,
right. But
yeah.
I think that's going to be an important, so going even beyond what the sociodemographic characteristics are of the people in general, what the economy, that local economy looks like in each context might explain why there's a let up at times, because there's something about that local economy that's going to matter for letting more of a flow in. And then my other question is, and I claim ignorance and not completely understanding how Chinese economy works. And it's very different than Mexico's economy, completely different. So what's the relationship with businesses in the state? Because there is some private businesses in China as well. And how we know in the United States and definitely in Mexico, there's a really close relationship with the market forces in corporate China, corporate America, corporate Mexico, as well as the state. And so there's a collusion, at least in the case, in my opinion, in Mexico, and certainly I think in the U.S. And so maybe that has something to do with it as well. So when you talked about migrants going into in the very beginning of the presentation of why we would be okay with letting migrants in, I think it has nothing to do with the morale. And I think it has everything to do.
I had to put it up there.
I'm sorry.
I know.
I think it has everything to do with the profit.
Yeah.
But it's because of that tenuous relationship between the state and the market forces.
Now, I'm just going to follow up a little bit. I mean, I think in China, and anyone from China who wants to jump in, you can feel free to do so. But I think the informal economy is most of the employment in the informal economy in China is through what's self-employment, and very small private businesses. There are some large businesses that hire workers informally, but I don't think that's most of. I think most of the employment is in these smaller. So the collusion. I think there's some collusion, but I think that the results of that collusion between corporate and government looks different than it might look in the U.S. or in Mexico. The comments about the local economy, I think, are absolutely extremely important in terms of the demographics, and we're going to have to just continue this conversation.
Yeah, I've got some other ideas, but I won't say anything more.
We'll have a back and forth after.
I thought it was very interesting as you were talking, because I originally was thinking about a country like what's happening in Europe and in like a country like Saudi Arabia, where there are migrant people working in the country, but they're sort of separate from the average Saudi Arabian, or in France and other places in Europe where the migrants are really, they're under severe restrictions under what they can do, and in Saudi Arabia where there's little contact with the actual population. And so you mentioned foreign workers, and I thought of that like in Saudi Arabia where the government is very restrictive of what can be done there. I wonder if there's kind of a parallel between the idea of an intensely rigid social system and the way that the government and the labor market work together.
That's an excellent question. And I must say, this talk, I presumed a certain level of. I skipped over some details about the Chinese system that would help answer this question. And one of the things I should say is, I mentioned the hukou system, said, oh, it's like an internal passport system. Well, the hukou system is created very much a system in which that you can draw parallels to foreign workers in other countries originally. So the hukou system prevented workers from just getting up and moving, and you had to request permission, register for lots of documents, and prove that you had work and a place to live in the city, et cetera, et cetera. And if you didn't, if you just picked up and moved and went to the city, you're an unregistered or illegal migrant in the city. You not only do you not have access to social welfare and protection of your rights, but you don't even have a right to be in the city. And if you're a registered migrant, you have a right to be in the city, but you have no access to social welfare or protections from the law. So I think there are those parallels. Now, as you saw in my presentation, the state has become a lot more tolerant and some even argue more supportive of migrants. So they're actually starting to suggest that maybe these migrants do have rights and they should be protected. So that's changing. But what I found in the informal economy is that it's very, very diverse. And then you do have some workers, for example, when I studied the construction workers, where they are on a construction site and there is a 10-foot wall around the construction site, and they live and work and play on that construction site. And they don't interact with the city folk. And then after that job's done, where do they go? To the next construction site, and to the next construction. And they do that for a year. And then they go home for 1 week or 2 weeks, and then they come back to the city and do that all over again. So you can imagine the social isolation. They're in the city, but they're not part of the city. But then there's other migrants who live in enclaves, and they sell their vegetables to the city people, and they interact with the city people, and they put down roots, and they have kids, and they get married, and they become integrated into the city. And their kids don't even have any connection to their hometown. So I think, that variance is what I'm trying to understand. And so some cities have a lot of migrants who are very isolated from the city, even though they live there. And some cities, the migrants are much more integrated. So how do I understand that variance within and across cities? So those comparisons, I think, are very legitimate. Yeah, very interesting.
Do they pay income taxes, or how are taxes collected in China?
Very good question. Actually, this was brought up to me during one of my practice sessions. That's another reason why governments care about the informal economy, because that represents revenue that's escaping their grip. I do think, however, that the West, and in particular the U.S., is extremely efficient in collecting taxes. And that doesn't translate necessarily into other national models. So while the loss of tax revenue is of some consideration, I'm sure, it's not the same sort of consideration we have in the United States about, I think for China, the concern about the informal economy is much more about social stability than taxes, where in the U.S. it's much more about taxes than social stability. They do collect taxes, but not nearly as efficient as we are. I lived in, and I think this is the same, like I lived in Korea for 3 years, and in Korea, if you make money, you have to pay taxes in the U.S., but if you pay taxes in Korea, you don't have to pay them here. They have some sort of agreement, so they nab you either way. But I just paid this Korean guy some money, and he gave me this thing that said I paid my taxes, and then I didn't have to pay it either place. So, I think it's a lot different than here, unless somebody has a guy.
The government must be aware of who the employers are. If they send toys over to the United States, don't they need an export permit or something?
Well, I think first, again, I think the employment in the informal economy in China is a lot of very small employers and self-employed and very, very small private employers. And they're subcontracting, so it becomes very complicated actually in what on the face seems like you know who's doing what. When you start peeling back the onion, you're left with quite a difficult trail to trace.
Can I just wanted to follow up one thing that you just said. So the people in the informal economy then they're subcontracted to the larger, bigger businesses.
Sometimes, not always.
Not always.
No,
Okay.
because the informal economy really does. For example, we have numbers on migrants, and migrants I use as a proxy of the informal economy, which isn't great because they represent about 70% of the informal economy, but